Hello everyone. CivilNet is in Tsaghkadzor covering an international symposium on Russia organized by the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. And today I'm joined by distinguished professor of history and political scientist Ronald Grigor Suny. Professor, thank you for joining us.
I'm very happy to be here.
I can, of course, introduce to our audience who you are, but you don't need any sort of introduction. Simply put, you are the patriarch of Soviet and Russian history. And as we were talking last time about the Russian role in our region, it's getting more complicated over time, and the world has become much more unpredictable nowadays. But many people still would say that history is repeating itself. I'm curious to understand if the history is really repeating itself, because some people think that certain patterns and certain developments in the past are recurring in the present or will recur in the future. But the fact is not all the similar historical developments end up with similar outcomes. So when we come back to our region and Russia's role here in the Caucasus, what we can say about that? Is it similar to 1918, 1920 situation, or is it totally different?
Things have changed because Russia is different now than it was in these earlier times. First of all, Russia is involved in a devastating war, which it launched itself, which did not go on as it wished, which now involves a long war of attrition. And its interests and its attention is all in Ukraine. And we saw in the last couple of years, after the Second Karabakh War, that Russia is not fulfilling even its obligations under the armistice that ended that war. So it seems to me this puts Armenia in a very difficult position, because on the one hand, Russia has been one of the few allies of Armenia, and Armenia has been the most loyal of allies of Russia, and yet at the present time, Russia has shown to be itself extremely undependable.
Yes, it's undependable, but it's indispensable at the same time.
I agree, yes. Yeah.
What to do?
The United States likes to call itself the indispensable nation, right? And Russia is not only indispensable, but I have to say, it's irreplaceable. There's no one else in the neighborhood who can help Armenia. Iran is in a difficult position. The US doesn't want Iran to be involved in
And
Armenia.
US not interested that much in this region as
it has
well.
its own problems at the moment, right? We can't depend on, obviously, Georgia. It has its own problems. And the other two states that border on Armenia are basically, opponents of Armenia, if not outright enemies of Armenia. So this is extremely dangerous neighborhood that Armenia lives in. And after losing the war 2 years ago, it means that Armenia is left on its own. And don't depend on America, because America is far away. It's concerned with its own interests, which are to somehow defeat Russia in Ukraine, and then turn its attention to what it's most interested in, is dealing with its own future opponent or competitor, namely China. So Armenia is way down on the list, and the United States' attention is not on this region.
So when we come back to Russia, at the beginning of the century, right before the First World War, the population of the Russian Empire was roughly 170 million, which constituted 9.5% of the world population. By the beginning of the Second World War, Russia's population was roughly 200 million, and it was accounted roughly 8.5% of the world population. Now Russia's population is around 140 million, with around 1.5% of the world population. I want to talk a bit about demography. Of course, we see the rising China, we see rising India. These were, for example, China's economy was somewhere similar to the Soviet economy by 1991. Now China is 10 times bigger, India is growing, so demography is playing really a huge role. So how is that demographic challenge going to impact our region? Can we expect new major players here?
So let's start with Russia. Russia is, as you said, demographically much weaker. It's an economic pariah in the world, heavily sanctioned by much of the capitalist world. Militarily, it has shown that its great strength is not so strong. It's mired in the war in Ukraine. So Russia, the difficulty for Russia is that its aspirations, its ambitions are greater than its capabilities, right? It is involved in Ukraine with something you can call imperial overreach. It wants too much and it doesn't have the strength to do what it thinks is necessary for its own security. Therefore, it has had to retreat from some of its areas where before it played important roles as protectors or mediators. And if you think of the South Caucasus, if you think of the end of the First Karabakh War, who made the armistice? It was Russia. If you think about the end of the Second Karabakh War, yes, they played a role, but now, given the efforts in Ukraine, Russia is almost absent. And Azerbaijan is taking advantage of that absence at the moment by threatening Armenia on its own frontier. So Russia, which is irreplaceable and thinks it is indispensable, is in fact absent in a real sense in the part of the world where it could make a difference. That's one thing. About the other countries, yes, the whole balance in the world is shifting. China is now rising power. I mean, maybe it's not doing economically as well as it was doing some years ago in the period of globalization, because the United States has started to fear China, fear its economic growth, its influence spread around the world, its new policies in the South China Sea, its potential threats against Taiwan, etc. So the United States wants to spend its own energy and attention on keeping China down. And even if the Chinese are right, keeping China from developing any further, right? We're not going to sell them new chips, computer chips. We're going to not sell them equipment. We're not going to allow them the favorable trade change conditions that we had before. Because the United States sees China now not only as a competitor, but sees it as a possible rival and opponent in the geopolitical conflicts that are developing. We are, in fact, I would say, as an American, our policy is turning a rival into an enemy, which I think is a wrong policy and a dangerous policy. Then the third power you mentioned is India. India is now, it turns out, the most populous country in the world. You wanted to talk about demography. It's growing, its population, and has outstripped China at the moment.
And you can see lots of Indians in Yerevan.
Yes. You get to see them all over the place. But India is still militarily inferior to China and doesn't present any threat militarily. It is developing economically in a kind of subordinate way to the capitalist world and even to China. So we'll see. But the most interesting thing about these new countries is that all three of the ones we just talked about, Russia, India, and China, they have a similar ambition, and that is not to allow the United States to remain the unchallenged global hegemon dominating the world. And the United States intends to remain a global hegemon, that's power spreads not only from the Western Hemisphere or Latin America, but to the South China Sea, to Central Asia, if possible, in a kind of minor way to the Caucasus, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Europe. So we see a real struggle here between countries that want some kind of regional hegemony, some authority in their parts of the world, and the very ambitious United States that wants to maintain what it gained after the collapse of the Soviet Union. No challenges from anyone else, and global hegemony, global dominance.
Although China and the United States are very much interdependent economically.
Yes.
So, but coming back to our region, and especially, I want to jump to 1920s, when Armenia and Azerbaijan had become Soviet republics. Armenian Bolsheviks were chasing their opponents, and the priority was to oppress Dashnaks rather than to focus their attention on Nagorno-Karabakh. So, and they didn't play the role that they could have played. And for Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh was of a more priority. And eventually there was this Gulf Bureau decision and the formation of Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Region. So when we compare these events of 100 years ago with the events now, do you think that Armenia, although the situation is again different from what we are talking about 100 years ago, but do you think that Armenia is sort of abandoning, sort of neglecting, rejecting its agency, its role that must be played now?
Let's go back in history. Let's go to those events, 1918, 1919, 1920. That was a different world, right? The young Soviet Republic was coming into the Caucasus and one by one taking over the independent, semi-independent republics in this area. First, Azerbaijan in about April 1920, then Armenia itself knocking out the Dashnag government and then fighting against the Dashnag-led rebellion in Tsaghkadzor. And then it moved up into Georgia, and by February 1921, and the victory over the rebels in the eastern part of Armenia, the new Soviet power was dominant in this area. And in those times, Bolsheviks took very seriously the principle of national self-determination, and particularly Armenian Bolsheviks, very interestingly, the dominant Bolsheviks around that time, and you can think of people like Alexander Myasnikyan, were not nationalist. They were anti-nationalist. And though Nagorno-Karabakh was given to Armenia first, the Azerbaijanis under Nariman Narimanov protested this, and eventually it was agreed with Stalin's also intervention, probably Orjonikidze if I remember correctly, that Nagorno-Karabakh would be an autonomous region within Azerbaijan. But what you have to realize is no one was thinking seriously about nationalism and national antagonisms at that time. The idea was we're going to move on beyond that. This is something that belongs to the old world, to the capitalist era. We're moving on. We're going to build socialism. We're going to get rid of nationalism. We're going to develop national cultures. So it was a different world, a world of tremendous optimism, even utopianism.
Was it illusory?
What?
Illusory.
I don't think it was illusory. I mean, I think the Bolsheviks had an amazing vision, and they managed, don't forget, for 70 years to govern this area, local Bolsheviks and Moscow, without serious inter-ethnic conflicts. Oh, there might be a struggle at a football game, you know, or Azerbaijani or Armenian historians will write that, no, this is our land, Albania, you know, Hղman was ours and so on. But these people were not killing each other. For 70 years, there was a kind of imperial overlord
that provided security.
That kept peace, right? Pax Sovieticus, you can call it, right? And then as Soviet power weakened under Gorbachev, and national aspirations developed. Because the effect of Soviet rule was not to destroy nations. The actual effect in this area was to make conscious, coherent nations stronger than they had ever been in their history, right? Armenians were more conscious, more educated, knew their history better, had their own opera, had their own radio stations, had their own film studios, etc. This was an achievement of Soviet power that people in the West have no idea about. And many people in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, now with the new nationalism, deny ever happened. Independent Armenia, independent Azerbaijan, independent Georgia are products of the Soviet period, of that 70 years of modernization, forced modernization, painful, sometimes bloody modernization, but that's what we got. And then when the Central Power, thanks to Gorbachev, who was killing the Soviet Union, I'm afraid to say, wonderful man, very humanist, not very strong, not strong enough to contain and maintain his own country. When that power began to dissolve, when the Soviet Union effectively began to commit suicide, then these national feelings which had been there began to bubble up. And we know that what happened after that. Conflict over Karabakh, where it should belong, murdering, pogroms in Sumgait and Baku, exporting or deporting Azerbaijanis from Armenia, let's not forget that, right? Ethnic cleansing of Azerbaijanis, the killings in different parts of the country, the destruction of Armenian monuments in Azerbaijan, and two wars, one which was won by the Armenians and one which was won by the Azerbaijanis. So here we are in a different world, right? And Armenia is in a very difficult position as a result of its defeat in the 44-day war.
What lesson we can draw from history and what can be a way out from this predicament?
That's a very good question, but as a historian, I look backwards to see if we have any solutions. And I'm very bad at predicting the future. I never thought the Soviet Union would collapse. I said that publicly, and it collapsed. So, you know, I'm not a prophet, I'm a historian. But if I look back at history and think about it, there were times and there were ways in which these peoples in the South Caucasus managed to live together. There is something you could call Caucasian civilization. There are things we share, even with Azerbaijanis or with Georgians. I give you, and those things maybe, when people become more rational and less emotional, maybe we can begin to develop these countries separately, but in cooperation rather than in conflict. I remember once in Soviet times, maybe the 1970s, I was visiting Gerart, this wonderful monastery we have in Armenia. And some people, villagers, were singing songs. And our guide, in-tourist guide, after all, I was a foreigner, so I was with an in-tourist guide, he was very upset. He was Armenian. He looks. These gyurakhtsis, these villagers, they're singing Azerbaijani songs. They're singing in Armenian, but the way the melodies are going, it's not Armenian. They listen to Radio Baku. Now, I'm not a nationalist, I'm an internationalist. I thought that was a good thing, that people are sharing cultures. This guy was upset. And I said to him, you know, you believe in narod, in the people, you know, zhogovurta. Yes, he says. You believe there should be, you know, zhogovurtagan yerashutyuna. Yeah, folk music. I said, well, this is folk music. This is what the folk, the real zhogovurt are singing. But no, it had to be. This is Azerbaijani. Oh, I'm not going to make that kind of dolma because that's what they eat in Baku. I'm not going to make this tsatsivi because that's what they... It was absurd. In other words, the Soviet Union had created new nations and even made them more national and more nationalistic. And now we have, when you leave the imperial overlord, you have these conflicts. But we also have traditions and things and cultures that we share. There is something called Caucasian civilization. And during the Soviet period, the very idea of Kavkaz was very alive as a common region. That has dissipated since then. That has become weaker as these nations have become more nationalistic. But I'm not hopeless. I believe that we can overcome this and we can begin to see that cooperation rather than conflict will give all of us a better future. That's not soon, because I would say, as an American and as an Armenian and as a historian and as a political scientist, that Azerbaijan is acting at the moment in a brutal, imperialist fashion. It wants to grab as much as it can and maybe eliminate Karabakh altogether because the Russians are not there to stop them. So at the moment, I have to be pessimistic, but in the future, I can be optimistic.
Professor Suny, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And keep watching CivilNet.